Content warning. The Matherson Marriage contains unhealthy relationship dynamics and fictional domestic abuse. If you are in a real-life Matherson marriage, please reach out to the appropriate authorities for help. Resources you may find helpful include the Pixel Project's Domestic Violence Resource page and UN Women's International Helplines list. Resources will be linked in the video description for accessibility. Hi, I'm Morgan, and today I will be reading from The Matherson Marriage by Ruby M. Ayres. Chapter 25. When Violet got back to Green Gables, she found Pansy still sitting in the empty nursery, an old broken wooden horse of Buster's lying in her lap. She never moved or looked up when Violet spoke to her. Her eyes were fixed on the skyline above the trees outside the open window, and her face was like death. "Darling," Violet said. She went to her and put her arms round her. "Do come and rest. You'll kill yourself. Just lie down. To me, please." Pansy shivered away from her, but made no answer. "You'd better leave her alone," Joyce whispered. She had followed Violet into the room, and the two girls exchanged despairing glances. "Where's Basil?" Violet asked. Joyce shook her head. "He's been up here once or twice, but it's no use." They went out on to the landing together. The door of Pansy's bedroom was closed, but they knew what lay inside in the dark and silence. Violet covered her eyes with her hands. "Oh, it seems as if it can't really be true," she said tremulously. "I think life is so horribly cruel." Joyce made no answer. Next to Pansy, she had felt Buster's tragic death more than anyone. She had been with him so much and loved him so dearly, but her eyes were tearless as she said painfully, "It's Pansy we've got to think of. Nothing can bring Buster back. Pansy, Violet, if we can't rouse her, she'll die." "I know, but what can we do? She won't speak to me, and Basil's perfectly useless." "I think he's tried his best," Joyce said reluctantly. She felt vaguely sorry for Matherson. "Tried his best!" Violet repeated scornfully. "A pretty poor sort of best. I hate him. He's weak and a coward and a bully. I wish he was dead." "Violet!" Joyce stared in amazement. "So I do!" Violet reiterated stoutly. "And so would you if you knew as much as I do." She broke off abruptly, turned on her heel, and went downstairs. Matherson was crossing the hall to the library, and after a moment she followed, shutting the door after her. "I've just seen Lynn," she began. Matherson turned. "Oh, so you've been running after him again, have you?" he said rudely. "Yes, I have." Violet came into the center of the room. "I had quite an interesting talk with him." "Indeed." There was a faint anxiety in his voice, but he shrugged his shoulders as if with total indifference, and sat down at the desk. "If that is all you have to tell me, I shall be glad if you'll go," he added disagreeably. "I'm very busy." "I'll go when I'm ready, and not before," Violet answered flatly. "I've got one or two questions to ask you first. Well, about Lynn, I mean." She flushed a little, and a half-sneering smile crossed Matherson's face. "And what about Lynn, my dear girl?" he asked cynically. "If you want me to ask him his intentions with regard to your very delightful self, If you're trying to make me angry, you won't succeed," she broke in flatly. "And what I want to know is, what are you going to do about this morning?" "This morning?" "Yes, about Buster." He spread his hands deprecatingly. "I fail to understand you." "Very well, then I'll explain." Violet spoke bravely, but she was trembling in every limb, and she leaned her hands on the edge of the table to steady herself as she went on. "This morning, when Buster was killed, I was there in the garden and saw what happened." There was a poignant silence. Matherson's face paled, but after a moment he pulled himself together. "Well, and what did happen?" he asked. She was scarlet with distress, and there were tears in her eyes. "I don't think you need me to tell you," she said brokenly. "But I want you to know this, that if tomorrow, at the inquest, Lynn tells the lie he says he is going to tell, I shall get up and say what I know." Matherson rose stiffly to his feet. "Have you taken leave of your senses?" he demanded hoarsely. "I've stood enough from you in all conscience, but this is going a little too far. Leave the room." "Certainly, now I've said what I came to say. As long as you understand that I'm in earnest, that's all right. If Lynn says that it was he who killed Buster, I shall get up and tell the truth, as I saw it, and chance what happens." She turned to the door, and had opened it when Matherson found his voice. "Come back," he said sharply. She looked at him over her shoulder. "What do you want?" "Come back and be sensible." "I am sensible. I was never more sensible, but I've had enough of lies and crookedness." He crossed the room, shut the door again, and put his back to it. "This is polite blackmail," he began thickly. "You dare say such a thing to me? Blackmail!" She laughed bitterly. "Are you afraid I'm going to blackmail you for £15,000 as you blackmailed Lynn?" The furious blood rushed to Matherson's face, and he clenched his hands, but he was afraid of her, and Violet knew it. "Who told you?" he demanded thickly. "Never mind. It's good enough that I know." She was drawing largely upon her imagination, and if Lynn's fool enough to be a Don Quixote, I'm not, and you'll either own up that it was you who killed Buster, or I'll tell Pansy why Lynn stopped coming to the house and whose fault it was. You wouldn't dare. She's your sister. What good do you think it's going to do to stir up mud like this?" She laughed bitterly. "You're right to call it mud." He took a step towards her. "There will be a scandal, and I hate scandals. I never asked Ramsden to take the blame. It was his own idea." An ugly sneer crossed his face. "Some tomfool idea of playing knight-errant again, I suppose. It's his own lookout anyway, not mine. Tell your story. Carry out your threat, and see what will happen. It will be your word against his and mine together, and I know Ramsden well enough to know that he'll stick to his story." He laughed triumphantly. "Pah! I rather fancy that will settle you, young lady." Violet looked at him silently. Then she said, very quietly, "But Pansy will believe me." "Pansy?" He winced. Then all at once his manner changed, and he fell to bleeding. "Don't tell her! For God's sake! She'll never forgive me! It was an accident. You know that if you saw what happened, I wouldn't have hurt a hair on the boy's head. It's preposterous to take this attitude. Don't tell her, Violet, I beg of you." "Tell her yourself, then." The tears were running down her face. "Oh, Basil, be a man and tell her yourself. She'll forgive you. I'm sure she will. But if later she finds out that you've lied." He paced away from her. I'll give you anything you'd like to keep quiet," he said in rough agitation. "You can stay here forever if you like. I'll give you money." Violet broke down into bitter sobbing. Basil! Basil! You must be mad. What are you made of? Don't you love Pansy at all? That you can behave like this? I don't want any money. You can't think as badly of me as that. But I want to help Pansy. I don't want her to be more miserable than she need. And if she knows that after all Lynn didn't." She broke off, struck by the sudden change in his face. His eyes seemed to narrow, and his mouth folded into cruel lines. "You mean that Ramsden is more to her than I am?" he asked, and his voice was dangerously quiet. "You know he is," Violet said in a whisper. There was a terrible silence. Then Matherson strode past her and flung the door wide. "Go!" he said. Violet looked into his eyes, and without another word passed him, and went slowly upstairs. Had she done right? Already she was filled with dread apprehension. What would Basil do now? What could he do? She tried to comfort herself. After all, she had only told him things which he already knew. Which he knew already, and she had been right about that money. It was blackmail. Common, vile blackmail. How could a man stoop so low? She despised Matherson with all her heart, and yet she was sorry for him. She hovered about on the landing restlessly. Matherson was still in the library, and Pansy alone in the nursery with a broken old horse clasped to her heart. What an appalling difference to life a few hours can make, she thought, and her heart failed her as she remembered that only that morning Buster had been alive and well. And now she glanced towards the closed door of Pansy's bedroom. "Thou, wow, 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 whose dog art thou? I am Tom Tinker's dog. Thou, wow, wow, wow." Never to hear his little merry voice again or his laugh, never to see him racing across the garden, or solemnly dragging his horse and cart round the paths. The silence that seemed to envelop the house now without him would remain unbroken forever. No wonder Pansy looked like death. There must be death in her heart, Violet was sure. The hours ticked by, and the evening shadows drew in. One of the servants came to say that dinner was ready, but Violet shook her head. "Nobody wants any dinner. I don't feel as if I shall ever want anything to eat again." But she went to Pansy once more and tried to rouse her. "Dearest, you must have something. You needn't come down, but let me bring you something up here. Just a very little. Just a cup of tea." Pansy turned her tragic eyes to her sister. "Leave me alone. Leave me alone." Violet answered eagerly. "I won't come near you again, I promise, if you'll just eat something. Just one mouthful." But it was useless. She went back to her vigil on the landing. "All the sorrow I have ever known has come through you." Those were the last tragic words Pansy had spoken to Lynn, and Violet wondered if he would ever forget them. It seemed monstrous to her youth that these two, loving one another as they did, should not only be parted, but parted by such a barrier of lies and misunderstanding. It's all wrong, she told herself fiercely. Lynn thinks he's doing the right thing, and I suppose he is really, poor darling, but it ought not to be allowed. If only I could put things right. Matherson came from the hall below. Isn't anyone coming to dinner? What's happened to the house? Are we all to starve? Brute, brute, Violet thought passionately, but she went down, afraid of a further scene. Pansy, sitting in the silent nursery, heard her sister's retreating steps and rose stiffly, the old horse still in her arms. She crossed the landing with dragging, difficult steps and opened her bedroom door. For a moment, the darkness blinded her. Then gradually she got accustomed to it and saw the gray twilight stealing in on each side of the windows, showing the outline of the bed and the little pathetic shape lying there. Someone had put flowers around poor little Buster, white roses, and their fragrance filled the room, and someone, Joyce perhaps, Pansy thought, had laid his favorite teddy bear beside him on the pillow. He had always slept with it at night, and now he was taking it with him on his last long sleep. They had brushed his hair down to hide the disfiguring bruise on his forehead, which had been the only visible injury, and, save for the pallor of death, which is like nothing in the world but death, he might have been asleep. Pansy knelt down and hid her face in the pillow beside him. She could not cry, and she could not pray. But at the back of her dazed mind was the hopeless thought that this could only be a horrible nightmare, from which she must soon waken. The silly little rhyme which Lynn had taught Buster rang through her head again and again. Bow, wow, 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 whose dog art thou? Buster had been so proud of his accomplishment. It seemed only yesterday that he had recited the lines to her when she came home from Lidstow after her father's death. She recalled the flushed excitement of his face and his insistent voice. Say it now, Dodie! Say it now! And she broke out aloud in anguished appeal to him. Buster! Buster! Darling! Speak to Dodie! Speak to poor Dodie! Just once more, my baby, my beautiful boy! Speak to poor Dodie! But there was no answer, nothing but unbroken silence, and Pansy knew that this was a nightmare dream from which she would never awaken, and that she was bereft indeed. And that is the end of chapter 25 of The Matherson Marriage by Ruby M. Ayres. Thank you for listening to this chapter with me, and I hope you return soon for the next one. Have a great day!